Some of you have already heard me give parts of this work here in different contexts, and basically in the short time that Muna has allowed me to compile my notes here, I'm just going to try to rework a little bit the narrative of how property was not simply just a question of legality as it evolved in the late 19th century into the 20th century, but primarily to talk also about how the issue of property was part of the very formation of state and very representation of state itself. So my work here was going to revolve a little bit between the very local and the very global in terms of what happened in the Levant as we moved forward. So in some places the evidence is a bit sketchy, in some places it's a bit more concrete, so bear with me. Basically, we cannot talk about property in the abstract. Property, as we have heard all day long today, is part of a political process, is part of a negotiated process, and part of that negotiation is very much global. It is about state rights, it is about how the social contract that emerges as a result of political forces on the ground. So in many ways, when we look at the transfer, that very critical juncture in time when property moved from the kind of documents that was set on the right to the kind of documents that's set on the left, it's not just a question of better organization of data. There's a very fundamental transformation that is happening here. On the one hand, the document to the right is primarily sort of a copy of the records of a religious court, and it documents what they call in English the deed. It is the transfer of property from one side to the other. It is the transfer of that property with all rights and obligations to that property that is recorded in the courts. And in many ways, it is certified by various signatures, so it gains credibility in as many as how many people sign on it. So it has that communal credibility to it, because the courts at that time, you could lose the records, people could influence the judges, somebody. So in as much as the community could solidify the deed, in as much as that deed was credible. Now, when we move to the document to the left, which is the beginning of the TAPO system, first of all, it is the state that is certifying the title. So that communal aspect of solidifying the rights and obligations on the property disappears. The state assumes itself very symbolically as the guarantor of right, something that it never did before in a very formalistic way. It did by power, it did by virtue of its local representation and its local representatives, the governors, the administrators. But now it's the state and the very abstract that is sort of setting itself very much as the guarantor. So it's symbolically putting itself in that form. There's no more community certification. There's no more history of transfer, so there's no, the property loses its social history that comes along with it. And in many ways, we also move into something that they call in English completely different than the deed. We have a title. So the state is a guarantor of title. And in many ways, the difference between these two documents, sociologically, politically, I'm not going to pretend to preach here in the room with Richard and Martha, and they are the gurus of this. What I'm trying to just highlight is, in a sense, how these documents get imbued with symbolic power as we move forward. Now, further on, the Ottoman Empire would develop some very rudimentary cartographic basis for these cadasters, for these tapos. But as we have heard in the presentation before, that process was very slow. The actual representation, in terms of graphic representation, in terms of mapping, actually hardly ever reached the region in the Levant, and only on very limited cases. And even in the more sort of central lands of the empire, that only came much later. So the actual sort of representation in physical norms was only sort of, as we have seen in the previous document. That remains pretty much the norm until more or less the French established a new cadastral system. Now, we cannot just talk about property in the abstract. We have to understand the bigger project of what was going on. At the same time and in the same process, the Ottoman Empire started the process of creating municipalities. And in many ways, we have here a certain formalization of local administration that is guaranteed power by the central state. So in essence, the municipalities were issued by central decree, and they were formed and imbued with power from the center to the periphery. It is, in a way, we'll talk about it a little bit just in a couple of slides from now, but it is, in a way, not local power. It is the local notables who have been given a certain privilege of managing local affairs in return for establishing and accepting the new representation and the new image of the state. Likewise, the process involved in many cities the beginning of a master planning project. We start noticing, not in all cities, but we start noticing in the more entrepreneurial cities, that the local governors started working on new master planning projects. This one is from 1899 from Halab. And what we have here is, as we are seeing, sort of a charting of a new territory, a charting of a new terrain. This is the old city intramural, and this was the extramural sort of neighborhoods of the city that grew more or less haphazardly in the 15th into the 19th century. And this was the moat surrounding the old city. Basically, what the Ottoman master plan did was it covered up this moat. It made a big avenue, and that avenue was continued, and a new terrain was charted. We've noticed in the presentation beforehand, we were talking about how the revenue stream was very important to the empire. So they were trying to expand the revenue stream. And one of the ways revenue streams were created was by actually developing more land. So the master planning process, which was accompanying also the cadastral development project, was in essence a preparation of a new territory for expansion, a new territory for valuation. We should not look at the cadasters simply as a typical tax on what is available. The project was not only to tax what is there, but to actually, there was to expand the frontiers of what could be taxed. I'll come back a little bit to this point later. Also part of the project was the establishment of a parliament. So the Mab'uthan Council, which was sort of like gathering all of the notables from all of the wilayats of the Ottoman Empire, in essence recodifying the symbolism of the state, recodifying the whole structure, but it was also recodifying the power of the new elite that the Ottoman Empire needed to ensure its promulgation and its sustainability. There was a pact being created between the central government and the new elite. If we remember that throughout the 15th and 16th and the 17th century, that deal was pretty much sort of the Ottoman Porte would send a governor to rule over the territory. In this case, what's happening is that the local elite are being called over to come and establish the frameworks through which they want to then come back into the municipalities and rule their territories. So there's a whole shifting of the paradigm of state rather than talking about a central power that is sort of moving from top down in terms of its governance structure. The central power was developing a new social contract with the elite that have emerged as a result of the Tanzimat over the last period. Also part of the transformation was the establishment of the Majalla. And the Majalla is, in a sense, a first attempt at developing a civil code out of the Hanafi jurisprudence body. We should not look at it as simply a matter of regulating or regularizing jurisprudence. It is very much the introduction of a civil code. So in essence, we are looking at establishing the framework that would normalize legal practices throughout the state, and in a sense reduce to the minimum the level of interpretation available to the local judges as to how they can rule. Now in the Majalla, we're still operating from within the framework of theologically driven definitions of property. They're modernized, they're benefiting from the evolution of Hanafi jurisprudence over the last 300 years, which has very much worked in terms of allowing the Ottoman Empire to solidify its hold onto communal lands by claiming all of communal lands to be part of the central state property. And in essence, the state bestows on people the right of use, but not the right of ownership. So in here, we have a continuation of that effort. That record, in a sense, was a first attempt at taming the sort of renegade judges and renegade interpretations of the Sharia all over the place. And there was, for a very short period of time, an attempt at a constitution, which lasted only for 2 years, and then it was abandoned, because in many ways, the Ottoman Empire at that stage, as much as it wanted to emulate European and modernizing standards, it did not want to democratize. So the constitution was tried for 2 years and it was abandoned. And in many ways, because the constitution was abandoned, we don't have a very firm definition of property as it stands. We still have only that document, which is more or less still defining property in old and traditional ways, albeit a bit modernized. Also in the process, we have a building code that is sort of imposed to homogenize building practices. So in many ways, we start deriving in the end of the 19th century more or less a style that is emerging in the empire. So all of these things should be seen as part of and parcel of one big project. We have the grand projects, sort of bringing in the official style to the various regions of the empire. Again, part of the normalization process. But let's not be fooled. This project was not to modernize the city per se. It was to modernize the representation of the city. The city itself, as it emerges, this is the eastern part of Aleppo. That part was never intervened on by anybody. The city that the Ottoman Empire was very much interested in was that western part where the new frontiers were expanding. That's where new property was to be developed. That was where new taxes were to be collected. So the eastern part was of no interest to anybody. And it continued to sort of grow as a result of the migration from the rural to the urban to supplement the growing industries and crafts that were happening in the empire. Very early on in the process, the streets that were sort of laid down by the master plan, the Ottoman master plan, were actually implemented. A hypothetical grid that was laid down on lands, and in many ways we're seeing a lot of people starting to develop the walls around it. So in complete contrast to the urbanization of previous years, we have the sort of plot. The notion of plot was not only sort of legally defined in the text, but actually physically defined by the code. So the whole physical understanding of what a property is was being transformed. Eventually, when the Faisal, King Faisal came to Syria, and he was to take over from the Ottoman Empire. This is the celebration that took place on an offside, sort of the main perpendicular to that street that we saw earlier. And as we have seen, there's only one building, and then the rest of the grid is pretty much empty. It's a hypothetical rational grid that has already been very much ingrained and established. I'll come back a little bit to that in a second, but what I want to show is that, in essence, Faisal came to a feat that was already there. There was already local notables that were very strong. There was already a sort of reality on the ground in terms of, if you want to govern the Levant, you have to respect that powerful class of people that was already there. That part of the pact forced Faisal to actually, towards the end of the 2-year short term that he ruled, to establish a constitution, a federalist constitution nonetheless. It was born out of the fact that he realized very vehemently that, in essence, if he was to rule over the Levant, he needed to actually acquiesce to local powers. And the whole constitution that was set up in, drafted in 1918, adopted in 1920, moved Syria and Lebanon pretty much in the line of a federalist state, in which the tax system of that new state was pretty much still, if we read that text, is pretty much still related to the old Muslim code of taxation. So it didn't deviate too much from a system of taxation that people were more or less comfortable with. It did not impose new taxes. For the most part, what it did was define sources of revenue for the state based on services. So the state at this stage needed to justify its keep for the people there. Faisal's government in the Levant didn't last but 2 years, and then the French went in. Gouraud went through the main avenue that was opened in the Ottoman Empire. So by the time Gouraud actually moved in, what I want to very clearly define is that these plots were already developed. These plots are very interesting because they were the sides of the moat of the old city of Aleppo. And what has happened here is that through the planning process, this no man's land actually became property. It became valued. Through the actual act of planning, we have the very first example of the state reclamating brownfield lands and claiming it for itself to be sold later on for private property. So the state gets itself involved already in the process of creating property. That process is going to continue. So I just wanted to put this here to show that it was not the French cadasters that did it. The process had already begun before. Gouraud, of course, and the French mandate continued what was already there, the notion of a federalist system, but only they codified it on a sectarian level rather than on the regionalist level that was planned. And of course, the agreement between the French and the British defined the new state, a state that was not born out of local agreement, a state that was born out of an international mandate agreement. By 1936, the local elite managed to abolish the federalist system, went back to a nationalist state in Syria. And in many ways, we have the beginning of a new process of urban expansion. In this process, all of these lands that were here, that were awqaf lands, were already being taken over by the state. So the state planning process continued. And in a sense, we should not now forget that the planning that was being done in conjunction, because these are actually cadastral maps. So the cadastral maps on different scales were establishing new territories that could be actually expanded and that could be actually owned by the state, and from which the state could actually develop new title deeds. What was very interesting here is that that new territory was expanding on the expense of awqaf land, of communal lands, of lands that have agricultural ownership by private people, but who, in essence, had collective obligations on them, and were, for the most part, during the French Mandate, the new planning was about putting new rights of way that allowed the expansion into this new territory. The name of the process was sort of modernization, bringing hygiene, bringing formalization. All of this happened in the cities. The countryside was pretty much sort of abandoned to itself. Very little work took place in the countryside. One of the things we can actually see traces, this is the city of Homs. We can see how growth took place, sort of, these are the old agricultural plots of land. And in essence, we see that minor projects took the shape of the agricultural land. So in the bigger cities, the process was a bit more formal. In the smaller cities, the process was a bit haphazard. But all throughout, we have a growing sort of consumption of land as we move forward. Post-colonial period, the practice continues vehemently. The French planners were brought in to continue the process on many levels. And even though the master plans were developed for the city east and west, what gets implemented is only the western part. One of the big players in the post-colonial period are the awqaf administrations. In Syria in 1949, they actually get nationalized, and we have a national institution that becomes a major power broker in the real estate market. And the awqaf administration becomes a very powerful developer, creating more and more property on its agricultural lands, parceling them, subdividing it, and creating more high-value processes. The process moves forward as we go along. The same legal frameworks that were set up by the French become the norm as we move into the 70s and 80s, but now urbanization is taking place at such rapid pace. So the state actually imposes more constraint on the process, putting itself as the sole developer. By 1979, the state forces that decision, which in essence allows the beginning of spontaneous settlements to grow around the city because the state could not do its duty. Spontaneous settlements grew around the perimeters of cities. I just want to close on this. This is a case study from Aleppo. In essence, the state processes of actually creating value continued on the western end of the city. The eastern parts were pretty much left to their own to develop minimal services. Density-wise, these were the nicer part of the city, the higher-end parts of the city. When the actual rebellions took place and started in Aleppo, it is not surprising at the end of the day that the areas continued to be controlled by the state are the same areas. Today, we stand at the crossroads once again. This is the same municipality building, totally damaged, sort of very symbolically claiming or disclaiming that all of the progress that took place over the last 150 years is now for naught. And we're at the crossroads of asking ourselves, where do we go from now? In many ways, there are people who want us to go back to the pre-Ottoman developments and repeat the experiments all over again. There are also those who want us to redefine the state altogether by redefining the new social contract. And there's, of course, the state that's trying to hang out to its practices and its symbolic role as the legitimizer of property and of value, of course, with all of the corruption and other things involved. I'm sorry I took too long. I'll entertain questions later on.